Onimusha series is a weird franchise. It was made as a byproduct from developing Resident Evil 4, much like the Devil May Cry series, and Onimusha feels like the missing link between both types of gameplay. It's got the static camera angles and tank controls of Resident Evil, but it's more melee combat focused like DMC. The first game's tone was a mix of action and horror, with some odd bit of humor mixed in. The second game leans more towards a fantasy action tone, with some remnants of horror here and there, but it's a hell of a lot funnier because of several over-the-top performances, which is the reason why it's my personal favorite. I was worried that, since Onimusha 3 was bringing back the first game's protagonist, it would return to its horror roots and lose that oddball charm that defined Onimusha 2 for me. I'm so glad I was both wrong and right when it came to Onimusha 3. Onimusha 3 is a very ambitious game, both in how it plays and how it tells its story. Samanosuke returns from the first game, but now he has to share the spotlight with French police officer Jacques Blanc. A hallmark of the Onimusha games is that they use the likenesses of famous Japanese actors as a basis for their heroes, like how Samanosuke is based on Takeshi Kaneshiro. Onimusha 3's big draw was that they were going to use French actor Jean Reno to portray Jacques. Onimusha 3 is a paradigm shift for the series as an action game. There are more enemies on screen this time, and the game accounts for this by pulling the camera further back to show more characters on screen. And camera angles aren't strictly static this time. Now, some angles will track the player for a bit before cutting to another angle. This is a far cry from the claustrophobic angles you usually get from past games. The controls have finally given me something I've been dying for since the first game: full 3D movement support on the left analog stick. Now you can move around like any other 3D action game, but if you need to, you can still use a D-pad for tank movements. It's still pretty useful if you're focusing on a single enemy and need to strafe around them, either to avoid attacks or find a weak spot. The second biggest improvement is that melee and range attacks are mapped to separate inputs this time. Now you don't have to jump into the menu to switch weapon types for airborne enemies, but you still need to do so to swap melee weapons and arrow types. Luckily, the menus have also been improved, and it barely takes a second to jump in and switch out your equipment. The last big quality of life improvement is how purple souls work this time. Purple souls were introduced in the second game, and absorbing 5 of them automatically triggered Onimusha mode. This time, you can store up to 5 souls instead of the 4 from the last game, since absorbing the 5th soul no longer triggers Onimusha mode anymore. You can activate it manually by pressing in the right stick, or save it until you die, which will automatically trigger the mode. It's kind of like a safety net you can always replenish now. I had said that the game's plot was ambitious, and that's because the main conceit this time has to do with time travel. Samanosuke and Jacques get transported to each other's respective era, and they need to defeat the Genma and Nobunaga before they can return. At first, I thought this game was operating on Ninja Turtles 3 rules, where you need to trade places with another person from a different time to maintain balance. But Jacques runs into Samanosuke in feudal Japan anyways, even though Samanosuke is running around in modern-day Paris, after almost dying from his last fight with Nobunaga. According to the Oni that appeared before Jacques and gave him his own Oni gauntlet to match with Samanosuke's, Jacques arrived in Japan 3 days before Samanosuke fought Nobunaga. He needs to help Samanosuke win that fight this time, and is going to do it with his unique weapon, the Oni Whip. Jacques' whip has a different fighting style compared to Samanosuke's more direct methods. He can deliver quick strikes like his partner, but he can also bind his enemies and throw them around, or use the whip as a conduit for magic. Or he could, just bust a cap or two in his target. The downside to the whip is that you need to power up the Oni gauntlet in order to throw around heavier enemies, and charging up the whip can take some time, which will leave you exposed to attacks. Jacques' whip also affects how he travels in the world. There are Oni fireflies that serve as anchor points for you to grapple onto with the whip. They'll either take you across large gaps, or to higher or lower parts of the level. They remind me of the Grim Grips from Devil May Cry 4, only more automated and less timing intensive. To help Jacques and Samanosuke in their quest, the Oni provides them the Tengu Akko as their assistant. At first I thought I was going to have terrible Ocarina of Time flashbacks, but Akko is very useful and not too grating a presence. In the story, she has an aura that lets everyone around her understand each other, so she's a conceit for how Jacques and Samanosuke along with a few other people, can communicate. In-game, she works as the player's targeting reticle, much like Navi, to show you which enemy you're focused on, either manually or with a soft targeting. Akko can also open certain chests, which are always out of the player's reach, and pick up items that enemies will sometimes drop on death, or from objects after you destroy them. You actually look forward to hearing Akko call out for you, because it always comes with an item drop. In the menus, her tab is where you keep track of all the vests you can find in-game. These vests offer passive buffs, and can be really helpful once you understand their quirks, but first, you need to find the resources to power them up before you can wear them. Akko's last skill is to transfer items between heroes, once you gain the ability to switch perspectives. The early part of the game is structured so that you alternate between Samanosuke and Jacques and follow each of their journeys. Usually, each chapter culminates in a boss fight, and ends with whichever hero asking Akko to check in on the other guy. Once everything's been properly established, dungeons in the second act have puzzles that require the player to manually switch between Samanosuke and Jacques so that they can work together and send each other keys across time. You give Akko items to ferry over to your partner to open doors and sometimes unlock bonus chests. By the third act, the game returns to the structure of switching between each hero after key boss fights. While Jacques is mostly working with Samanosuke in Japan, Samanosuke runs into Jacques' fiancée, Michelle Aubert, who is also part of the police force, and Jacques' son Henri, who is surprisingly the least annoying child in video games. Part of the deal between Samanosuke and Jacques is that Samanosuke will ensure Michelle and Henri's safety, so that Jacques can help Samanosuke defeat Nobunaga. The supporting cast for Onimusha 3 isn't as memorable as the 1 and 2, but they are still responsible for the funniest scene in the entire series. It's a perfect summation of the game.
Hello. Yes, come in.
Hello, Henri.
Where's Dad?
Well, actually...
Who is he?
This is Mr. Samanosuke. He's a samurai from Japan.
Serious?
I wish I could be as favorable towards the bosses in this game. I need to make a distinction when it comes to Onimusha 3's bosses. They are the best implemented boss fights in the series thus far, but the bosses themselves aren't that memorable. Guildenstern is a returning boss, but he only gets one fight and a handful of moments before he dies 2/3 into the game. Another boss feels like a rehash of a character that was done better in Onimusha 2. The closest any of them get to reaching the level of 2's bosses is Ranmaru Mori, Nobunaga's new toady. He starts off as a regular human in the beginning, and is technically the first boss fight in the game, but he's a real pushover in this form. Later on, Guildenstern experiments on him, and transforms him into a Genma, and that's where he becomes a bit of a terror. He has the worst boss ability, which is that he can dodge all of my attacks whenever he feels like it. He reminds me of Gogen Dantis from Onimusha 2 when he does it, but he's far less charming. I can't take Ranmaru seriously when he turns into a Genma, because his voice makes it sound like he's going through puberty at the worst possible time.
You look terrible, Ranmaru.
Silence! I have power beyond anything you have ever seen! Prepare yourself, Samanosuke!
Ranmaru is one of the characters affected by the time travel shenanigans. Samanosuke killed him the first time they met, but when Jacques and Samanosuke confront him, it's technically the first time he's ever met the two, since he and Samanosuke haven't fought in front of Nobunaga yet. You see what I mean about the story getting convoluted? When I said boss fights are better implemented, that's mostly due to the camera and level design. The arenas are closed off areas this time, and provide wide open space for maneuvering around bosses, compared to some of the more cramped areas from past games. Jacques has an extra advantage in some of his fights, because there will usually be metal rings in the ceilings of his arenas, and he can use his Oni whip to grapple onto them and avoid enemy attacks. Having the camera pulled further back helps you keep track of the boss's positions better, so you won't get hit from off-screen attacks. At certain points, the Samanosuke in Paris becomes indisposed, and Michelle takes over as a playable character. She only uses guns, and something I like about setting the game in France is that the police use FN weapons like P90s and the FAMAS. Her levels are simple and feel the most like Resident Evil, since it's more about key hunting. Speaking of France, Capcom took full advantage of the setting by having levels set in famous landmarks like Notre Dame Cathedral and the Eiffel Tower. It's got some pros and cons. Placing Samanosuke in an alien setting evokes that same sense of isolation that's found in the first Onimusha. The French monuments are great for Western audiences, since their imagery grounds the game's setting for that audience in a way that historical Japanese villages can't. The downside to it is that it feels like quite a stretch for Samanosuke to be able to find Oni weapons in France. It makes sense when Jacques finds Oni weapons in Japan, since they're part of that country's folklore. It feels like an Assassin's Creed game when I can find a set of magic swords underneath L'Arc de Triomphe. I feel it even more in Notre Dame, when you need to purify 4 goddess statues to power up an Oni weapon, in a Catholic church. Something interesting I find about Onimusha 3 is that it varies up its set pieces a lot more than in previous games. Samanosuke and Jacques investigate a port city early in the game, and it's the only time you see a populated city in-game. This part of the game has some light adventure game mechanics, since you need to exchange items with townsfolk in order to find the means to eavesdrop on a merchant who kicked you out of his store. Another level has Jacques and Samanosuke riding on icebergs and using Oni fireflies to steer their platforms away from hazards. One set piece involved Samanosuke and Michelle pushing a detached wrecking ball through a sewer tunnel to reach Michelle's men. My favorite set piece is the assault on the Genma fortress, because the game suddenly turns into a Dynasty Warriors level. It's super easy here to fluke into chaining critical strikes, since all the enemies are low-tier Genma. One of the key moves you need to learn in all the Onimusha games is the ability to pull off critical strikes. You can do them in a couple of ways. If an enemy is about to attack you, and you block the second they make contact, you can press the attack button and do a critical. Or you can just do the attack at the last possible second and trigger an even stronger critical. Criticals kill any Genma that isn't a boss in one hit, and they guarantee yellow souls on death, which restore your health, so it's important to get this skill down. Onimusha 2 added some depth to combat by introducing a charge-up ability. If you stayed in a power stance for a few seconds, your weapon will glow, and attacking will deal some extra damage. You can increase the level of charges by upgrading your weapons in Onimusha 2, but in 3, you need to upgrade the Oni Gauntlet instead. The best thing about these two mechanics in 2, and another reason why I prefer that game most of all, is that if you had a level 3 charge on your weapon and did a critical on one enemy, you would automatically follow that up with another critical on a nearby enemy, and continue to do so until all the enemies that spawn in the arena are dead. It changed how I prioritize rooms, because after discovering that, I tried to find the enemies who were the easiest to critical to set up my killing sprees. Onimusha 3 takes that auto-kill ability away, unfortunately. You can still chain criticals, but this time, you need to time your follow-up attacks in a certain rhythm, and you can do this for as long as there are enemies on screen. It sucks to lose such a powerful move, but I can understand Capcom's desire to make the game more skill-intensive. When it comes to puzzles, Onimusha is a lot more straightforward than Resident Evil. It almost always plays like this. A path branches off, and you find a locked door that will require a key. So you go to the opposite path to retrieve that key, and backtrack. When you get to the sections that require you to switch between heroes, it turns into an adventure game again, since you need to either send your partner a key or an item, so that they can change the state of the world to benefit each other. It's where the time travel mechanics get to shine in game, and the flow of gameplay becomes a rhythm between key hunting and switching over. The best example would be when Samanosuke gives a key to Jacques to open a room that contains a bunch of French slaves and a seed for a demonic plant. You plant that seed in a bed of soil nearby, and switch over to Samanosuke, who then uses that fully grown demonic plant to climb down to the lower levels. The environmental storytelling in Onimusha 3 is fantastic. When you're in that port city to investigate a merchant's connections with the Genma, his store looks like what you'd expect from a place set in feudal Japan. But he's also got a stockroom by the docks that contains objects totally out of time, like CDs and refrigerators. The Genma layers you find in the story are pretty gruesome looking, and there's a file you can find that explains that the Genma really do decorate the places they infest to feel more like home. A really clever one was in Notre Dame Cathedral, where the interior looks like a normal church, but underneath, everything's covered in fleshy walls and skulls. Guildenstern admits to spending some of his time in the present day, using the skulls from the French catacombs to give his new lair some pizzazz. There are some weird plot holes that plague Onimusha 3's story. Jacques somehow finds his bike in the port city, and needs it to catch a demon ship leaving the docks, but he's missing his keys. Henri can somehow sense this across time, and fetches the keys from the keyring, and gives it to Akko so she can bring it to Jacques. But Jacques was already using that bike in the beginning, so how were the keys in his apartment? Are they a separate set? And it's never explained how Henri can sense whenever his dad needs help. It happens again when Jacques is trapped in a room filling with poison gas, and Henri teaches him how to disable it through time, which is an excuse for a timed memory puzzle. The final act of the game has Samanosuke returning to the same fight we started with him in the beginning, but this time with Jacques in tow. And in Paris, Samanosuke and Jacques' family reach the Eiffel Tower to stop the time machine in case Jacques and Samanosuke fail to defeat Nobunaga. There has to be a better way to distinguish between both Samonosukes. At this point, you have one more chance to enter the Dark Realm, which is a series of challenge rooms where you fight all the enemies that spawn in and move on to the next room. The Dark Realm is a staple in every Onimusha game, but this time, there's a map to show you where you're going instead of choosing to go further down or exit. There will be a chest that requires a certain number of keys to open, and that's your motivation for going through as many rooms as possible. There are chances to enter the Dark Realm earlier in the game, and they all offer some very good items, but the most important ones give you a vest that reduces the amount of damage you use on your weapons, and the final weapons for each hero. Whether or not you choose to do the Dark Realm challenges, this is the point where you fight Nobunaga. He is a tough fight. He has a lot of health and can pull off critical strikes if you get him at the wrong time. You can go on forever and eat through all of your health items, but if you had your ultimate weapon, it looks like Jacques killed Nobunaga and is about to return home, but Nobunaga faked them out and kills Samanosuke. When he returns to Paris, Jacques tells that Samanosuke what happened as he returns to his era. Just when it looks like Jacques and his family can finally relax, Ranmaru comes back for one more chance at being a little bitch. Jacques whips him to death and then mourns over his dying son. The Oni's last gift is to use the gauntlet to heal Henri, and Jacques remains thankful for everything the Oni have done to protect his family. So remember when I said that I thought the game was operating on Ninja Turtles 3 rules? No, it turns out the game is operating on Futurama rules, where time paradoxes will always get resolved by killing off the redundant time clone. Samanosuke in Paris failed to stop Ranmaru from activating the time portal, but now he has a second chance to fight Nobunaga. He returns and absorbs the dead Samanosuke into his body, along with his Oni gauntlet, and this transforms him into his Onimusha form. Unfortunately, you don't get to use Samanosuke's ultimate weapon for his boss fight, and as far as I know, they don't carry over to New Game Plus, which I feel is a misstep on Capcom's part, since you can unlock other weapons to bring into New Game Plus. Samanosuke defeats Nobunaga again, and again, he refuses to die, and brings Samanosuke with him into the Genma realm for one more fight. This is where Nobunaga really dies, and Samanosuke absorbs his soul into the Oni gauntlet to seal him away forever. And so ends Onimusha 3. It's an interesting game that has some great quality of life improvements, but I did have to get over my initial bias for Onimusha 2 to really appreciate it. I should point out that I've been emulating the game, and that presents some graphics issues that wouldn't have happened on a disc copy. One cutscene slowed down to a crawl, and I had to switch my graphics plugins just for that scene so it would play properly, but at the cost of worse graphics. So I'd switch plugins just for that scene, and switch back with no other instances of slowdown. Something much worse was that some dungeons in my game would have severe draw distance issues, and that would occlude my vision. This made some parts really suck, because there would be enemies in those occluded areas, and one of them was during a boss fight with Ranmaru, so I had to rely on sound cues for his attacks. Again, that's an emulator issue, and definitely not something you'd see on disc. It's a great game, has some unexpectedly funny moments,
Guildenstern.
And is a good blend of fantasy horror from the first Onimusha and the oddball charm of the second.